Mr. and Mrs. Dudley of Number 4 Private Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal, thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious, because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dudley was the director of a firm called Gunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large mustache. Mrs. Dudley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbors. The Dudley had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dudleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out that the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dudley's sister, but they didn't meet for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dudley pretended that she didn't have a sister because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband was as un-Dudleyish as it was possibly to be. The Dudleys shuddered to think what the neighbors would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dudleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never even seen him. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dudley woke up on the dull gray Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy sky outside to suggest that strange and mysterious thing would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dudley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dudley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large, tawny owl flutter past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dudley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dudley on the cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but he missed, because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereal at the wall. "Little tyke," chortled Mrs. Dudley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out a number for his drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dudley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around to look again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Private Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could it be? What could he have been thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dudley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dudley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that says Private Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dudley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove towards town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drill that he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in the usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help noticing that there seems to be a lot of strangely dressed people. People in cloaks. Mr. Dudley wouldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes. The get-up you saw in young people. He supposed there was some sort of stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eye fell on a huddle of these weirdos standing quite close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dudley was encouraged to see that Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably some silly stunt. These people were obviously collecting for something. Yeah, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later, Mr. Dudley drove in the gunning parking lot, and his mind back on drills. Mr. Dudley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the ninth floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owls sweeping past in broad daylight, though people down the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as the owl after owl speeded overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl even at nighttime. Mr. Dudley, however, had a perfectly normal, owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people, he made several important telephone calls, and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his leg and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the bakery. He'd forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This bunch were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collector tin. It was on his way back past them, clutching a large donut in a bag, that he caught a few words of what they were saying. The Potters, that's right, that's what I heard. Yeah, their son, Harry. Mr. Dudley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whisperers as if he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up in his office, snapped at his secretary to not to disturb him, seized his cell phone, and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there were lots of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He's never seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dudley. She always gets so upset at any mention of a sister. He didn't blame her if he had a sister like that. But all the same, those people in cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon when he left the building at 5 o'clock. He was still so worried that he walked straight up to someone just outside of the door. Sorry, he groaned, as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mrs. Dudley realized that the man was wearing a velvet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset at being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face slipped into a wide smile and said in a squeaky voice that made passerby stare, "Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Dudley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dudley stood rooted to the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he had been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car and set up for home, hoping he was imagining things, which he had never hoped before because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he had spotted that morning. It was now sitting on the garden well. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same marking around its eyes. "Shoo," said Mr. Dudley loudly. The cat didn't move. It just gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behavior? Mr. Dudley wondered. Trying to pull himself together, he let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dudley had had a nice normal day. She told him over dinner all about Mrs. Next Door's problem with her daughter and how Dudley had learned a new word, won't. Mr. Dudley tried to act normally. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went to the living room in time to catch the last report on the evening news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported that nation's owl have been behaving very unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night and hardly ever seen at daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why those owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newscaster allowed himself a grin. Most mysterious, and now over to Jim McGuffin with the weather. Going to be more showers of owls tonight, Jim? Well, Ted, says the wise man, I don't know about that, but it's not only the owl that have been acting oddly lately. Viewers as far apart as Dent, Yorkshire, and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of the rain I promised yesterday, they've had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise a white night tonight. Mr. Dudley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting star all over Britain? Owls flying by daylight? Mysterious people in cloaks all over the place? And a whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dudley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear? You haven't heard from your sister lately, have you? As he had expected, Mrs. Dudley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretend that she didn't have a sister. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny stuff on the news, Mr. Dudley mumbled. Owls, shooting stars, and there were a lot of funny-looking people in town today. So? Snapped Mrs. Dudley. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her crowd. Mrs. Dudley slipped her tea through pursed lip. Mr. Dudley wondered whether he dared tell her he'd heard the name Potter. He decided that he didn't dare. Instead, he said as casually as he could, their son. He'd be about Dudley's age right now, wouldn't he? I suppose so, said Mrs. Dudley stiffly. What's his name again? Howard, isn't it? Harry. Nasty common name, if you ask me. Oh, yes, said Mrs. Dudley, his heart sinking horribly. Yes, I quite agree. He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dudley was in the bedroom, Mr. Dudley crept into the bedroom window and peered down into the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Private Drive as though it was waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all this have been anything to do with Potters? If it did, if it got out that they were related to a pair of... Well, he didn't think he could bear it. The Dudsleys got into bed. Mrs. Dudley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dudley lay awake, turning it all over again in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dudley. The Potters knew very well that he and Petunia thought about them, what he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. How very wrong he was. Mr. Dudley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no sign of sleepiness. It was sitting as still as a statue, its eye fixed unblinkingly on the far corner of Private Drive. It didn't so much as quiver when a car door slammed on the next street, or when 2 owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner the cat had been watching, appeared so suddenly and silently, you'd have thought he just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched, and his eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen on Private Drive. He was tall, thin, and very old, judging by the silver of his hair and beard, which was both long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak that swept the ground, and high-heeled, buckled boots. His blue eyes were light, bright, and sparkly behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. The man's name was Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore. Albus Dumbledore didn't seem to realize that he had just arrived in the street where everything from his name to his boots were unwelcome. He was busy rummaging in his cloak, looking for something. But he did seem to realize he was being watched, because he looked up suddenly at the cat, which was still staring at him from the other end of the street. For some reason, the sight of the cat seems to amuse him. He chuckled and muttered, "I should have known." He found what he was looking for in his inside pocket. It seems to be a silver cigarette lighter. He flicked it open, held it up in the air, and clicked it. The nearest street lamp went out with a little pop. He clicked it again. The next lamp fluttered into darkness. 12 times he clicked the put-outer, until the only light left on the whole street were 2 tiny pinpricks in the distance, which were the eyes of the cat watching him. If anyone looked out of their window now, even beady-eyed Mrs. Dudley, they wouldn't be able to see anything that was happening down the pavement. Dumbledore slipped the put-outer back into his cloak and set off down the street towards number 4, where he sat down on the wall next to the cat. He didn't look at it, but after a moment he spoke to it. "Fancy seeing you here, Professor McGonagall." He turned to smile at the tabby, but it had gone. Instead, he was smiling at a rather severe-looking woman who was wearing square glasses, exactly the shape and marking of the cat had around its eyes. She too was wearing a cloak, an emerald one. Her black hair was drawn into a tight bun. She looked indistinctly ruffled. "How did you know it was me?" she asked. "My dear Professor, I've never seen a cat sit so stiffly." "You'd be stiff if you'd been sitting on a brick wall all day," said Professor McGonagall. "All day? When you could have been celebrating? I must have passed a dozen feasts and parties on my way here." Professor McGonagall sniffed angrily. "Oh yes, everyone is celebrating, all right," she said impatiently. "You'd think they'd be a little more careful, but no. Even the Muggles have noticed something's going on. It was on their news." She jerked her head back at the Dursleys' dark living room window. "I heard it. Flocks of owls, shooting stars. Well, they're not completely stupid. They were bound to be noticed something. Shooting stars down in Kent. I'll bet that was Delalue's Dungle. He never had that much sense." "You can't blame them," said Dumbledore gently. "We've all had precious little to celebrate for 11 years." "I know that," said Professor McGonagall irritably. "But that's no reason to lose our head. People are being downright careless, out on the street in broad daylight, not even dressed in Muggle clothes, swapping rumors." She threw a sharp sideway glance at Dumbledore here, as through, hoping he was going to tell her something, but he didn't. So she went on. "A fine thing it could be if, on the very day you-know-who seemed to have disappeared at last, the Muggles found out about us all. I suppose he really had gone, Dumbledore." "It certainly seems so," said Dumbledore. "We had much to be thankful for. Would you care for a lemon drop?" "A what?" "A lemon drop. They're kind of a Muggle sweet I'm rather fond of." "No, thank you," said Professor McGonagall coldly, as though she didn't think this was the moment for lemon drops. "As I say, even you-know-who has gone." "My dear Professor, surely a sensible person like yourself can call him by his name. All this you-know-who nonsense. For 11 years I have been trying to persuade people to call him by his proper name, Voldemort." Professor McGonagall flinched, but Dumbledore, who was unstinking 2 lemon drops, seemed not to notice. "It all gets so confusing if we keep saying you-know-who. I've never seen any reason to be frightened of saying Voldemort's name. I know you haven't," said Professor McGonagall, sounding half exasperated, half admiring. "But you're different. Everyone knows you're the one you-know-who. Oh, all right, Voldemort was frightened of." "You flatter me," said Dumbledore calmly. "Voldemort had powers I will never have. Only because you're too, well, noble to use them. It's lucky it's dark. I haven't blushed so much since Madame Pomfrey told me she liked my new earmuffs." Professor McGonagall shot a sharp look at Dumbledore and said, "Owls are nothing next to rumors that are flying around. You know what everyone is saying about why he disappeared? About what finally stopped him? It seems like Professor McGonagall has reached the point she was most anxious to discuss. The real reason she had been waiting on a cold, hard wall all day for either Neither as a cat nor as a woman had she fixed on Dumbledore with such piercing stare as she did now. It was plain that whether everyone was saying, she was not going to believe it until Dumbledore told her it was true. Dumbledore, however, was choosing another lemon drop and did not answer. What they're saying, she pressed on, is that last night Voldemort turned up in Godric's Hollow. He went to find the Potters. The rumor is that Lily and James Potter are that they are dead. Dumbledore bowed his hand. Professor McGonagall gasped. Lily and James. I can't believe it. I didn't want to believe it. Oh, Albus. Dumbledore reached out and patted her on the shoulder. I know, he said heavily. Professor McGonagall's voice trembled as she went on. That's not all. They're saying he tried to kill Potter's son, Harry, but he couldn't. He couldn't kill that little boy. No one knows why or how, but they're saying when he couldn't kill Harry Potter, Voldemort's power somehow broke. That's why he's gone. Dumbledore nodded glumly. It's true? Faltered Professor McGonagall. After all he's done, all the people he's killed, he couldn't kill a little boy? It's just astounding of all the things to stop him. But how in the name of heaven did Harry survive? We can only guess, said Dumbledore. We may never know. Professor put out a lace handkerchief and dabbed at her eyes beneath her spectacles. Dumbledore gave a great sniff as he took a golden watch from his pocket and examined it. It was a very old watch. It had 12 hands but no numbers. Instead, little planets were moving around the edge. It must have made sense to Dumbledore, though, because he put it back in his pocket and said, Hagrid's late. I suppose it was he who told you I'd be there, by the way? Yes, says Professor McGonagall, and I don't suppose you're going to tell me why you're here, of all places. I've come to bring Harry to his aunt and uncle. They're the only family they've left now. They're the only family he has left now. You can't mean the people who live here, cried Professor McGonagall, jumping to her feet and pointing at number 4. Dumbledore, you can't. I've been watching them all day. You couldn't find 2 people who are less like us. And they've got this son. I saw him kicking his mother all the way up the street, screaming for sweets. Harry Potter, come and live here. It's the best place for him, said Professor Dumbledore firmly. His aunt and uncle will be able to explain everything to him when he's older. I've written them a letter. A letter, repeated Professor McGonagall faintly, sitting back down on the wall. Really, Dumbledore, you think you can explain all this in a letter? These people will never understand him. He will be famous, a legend. I wouldn't be surprised if today is known as Harry Potter Day. In the future, there will be books written about Harry. Every child in our world will know his name. Exactly, said Dumbledore, looking very seriously over the top of his half-moon glass. It will be enough to turn any boy's head. Famous before even he can walk and talk. Famous for something he won't even remember. Can you see how much better off he will be, growing up away from all that until he's ready to take it? Professor McGonagall opened her mouth, changed her mind, swallowed, and then said, Yes, you're right, of course. But how is the boy getting here, Dumbledore? She eyed his cloak suddenly as though she thought he might be hiding Harry underneath it. Hagrid is burying him. You think it wise to trust Hagrid with something as important as this? I would trust Hagrid with my life, said Dumbledore. I'm not saying his heart isn't in the right place, said Professor McGonagall grudgingly. But you can't pretend he's not careless. He does tend to... What was that? A low rumbling sound has broken the silence around them. It grows steadily louder as they looked up and down the street for some sign of a headlight. It swelled to a roar as they both looked up at the sky, and a huge motorcycle fell off the air and landed on the road in front of them. If the motorcycle was huge, it was nothing to the man sitting astride it. He was almost twice as tall as a normal man and at least 5 times as wide. He looked simply too big to be allowed, and so wild. A long tangle of bushy black hair and beard hid most of his face. He had hands the size of trash can lid, and his feet, their leather boots, were like baby dolphins. In his vast, muscular arm, he was holding a bundle of blankets. Hagrid, said Dumbledore, a sounding relief. At last, and where did you get that motorcycle? Borrowed it, Professor Dumbledore, sir, said the giant, climbing carefully off the motorcycle as he spoke. Young Sirius Black lent it to me. I've got him, sir. No problems, were there? No, sir. House was almost destroyed, but I got him out all right before the Muggles started swapping around. He fell asleep as he was flying over Bristol. Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall bent forward over the bundle of blankets. Inside, just visible, was a baby boy, fast asleep. Under a tuft of jet black hair over his forehead, they could see a curiously shaped cut, like a bolt of lightning. Is that where? Whispered Professor McGonagall. Yes, said Dumbledore. He'll have that scar forever. Couldn't you do something about it, Dumbledore? Even if I could, I couldn't. I wouldn't. Scars can come in handy. I have one myself above my left knee that is a perfect map of the London Underground. Well, give him here, Hagrid. We'd better get this over with. Dumbledore took Harry in his arm and turned towards Leslie's house. Could I say goodbye to him, sir? Asked Hagrid. He bent his great shaggy head over Harry and gave him what must have been a very scratchy, whiskered kiss. Then suddenly, Hagrid let out a howl like a wounded dog. Shh! Hissed Professor McGonagall. You'll wake the Muggles. Sorry, sobbed Hagrid, taking out a large spotted handkerchief and buried his face in it. But I can't stand it. Lily and James dead, and poor little Harry off to live with Muggles. Yes, it's all very sad. But get a grip on yourself, Hagrid, or we'll be found, Professor McGonagall whispered, patting Hagrid gingerly on the arm as Dumbledore stepped over the low garden wall and walked to the front door. He laid Harry gently on the doorstep, took a letter out his cloak, tucked inside of Harry's blanket, and then came back to the other two. For a full minute, the three of them stood and looked at the little bundle. Hagrid's shoulders shook. Professor McGonagall blinked furiously, and the twinkling light that usually shone from Dumbledore's eyes seemed to have gone out. Well, said Dumbledore finally, that's that. We've no business staying here. We may as well go and join the several celebrations. Yeah, said Hagrid in a muffled voice. "I'd best get this bag away. Good night, Professor McGonagall, Professor Dumbledore, sir." Wiping his steaming eyes on his jacket sleeve, Hagrid swung himself onto the motorcycle and clicked the engine into life. With a roar, it rose into the air and off to the night. "I shall see you soon, I expect, Professor McGonagall," said Dumbledore, nodding to her. Professor McGonagall blew her nose in reply. Dumbledore turned and walked down the street. On the corner, he stopped and took out the silver outputter. He clicked it once, and 12 balls in light speed back to their street lamp, so the Private Drive glowed suddenly orange, and he could make out of a tabby cat slinking around the corner at the other end of the street. He could just see the bundle of blanket on the step of number 4. "Good luck, Harry," he murmured. He turned into his heel with a switch of his cloak, and he was gone. A breeze muffled in the hedges of Private Drive, which lay silent and tightly under the inky sky, the very last place you would expect astonishing things to happen. Harry Potter rolled over inside his blanket without waking up. One small hand closed on the letter beside him, and he slept on, not knowing he was special, not knowing he was famous, not knowing he would be woken in a few hours' time by Mrs. Dursley's scream as she opened the front door to put out milk bottles, nor that he would spend the next few weeks being pulled and pinched by his cousin Dudley. He couldn't know that at this very moment, people meeting in secret all over the country were holding up their glasses and saying in their hushed voice, "To Harry Potter, the boy who lived." Chapter 2: The Vanishing Glass. Nearly 10 years has passed since the Dursleys have woken up to find their nephew on the front step. But Prairie Drive has hardly changed at all. The sun rose on the same tidy front garden and lit up the brass number 4 on the Dursleys' front door. It crept into their living room, which was almost exactly the same as it had been on the night when Mr. Dudley had seen that fateful news report about the owls. Only the photographs on the mantelpiece really showed how much time had passed. 10 years ago, there had been lots of pictures of what looked like a large pink beach ball wearing different colored bonnets. But Dursley was no longer a baby, and now the photographs showed a large blond boy riding his first bicycle on the carousel at the fair, playing a computer game with his father, being hugged and kissed by his mother. The room held no sign at all that another boy lived in the house too. Yet Harry Potter was still there, asleep at the moment, but not for long. His Aunt Petunia was awake, and it was her shrill voice that made the first noise of the day. "Up! Get up! Now!" Harry woke with a start. His aunt rapped on the door again. "Up!" she screeched. Harry heard her walking towards the kitchen and then the sound of a frying pan being put on the stove. He rolled onto his back and tried to remember the dream he had been having. It had been a good one. There had been a flying motorcycle in it. He had a funny feeling that he had the same dream before. His aunt was back outside the door. "Are you up yet?" she demanded. "Nearly," said Harry. "Well, get a move on. I want you to look after the bacon, and don't you dare let it burn. I want everything perfect on Dudley's birthday." Harry groaned. "What did you say?" His aunt snapped through the door. Nothing. Nothing. Dudley's birthday. How could he have forgotten? Harry got slowly out of bed and started looking for socks. He found a pair under his bed and after pulling a spider off one of them, put them on. Harry was used to spiders because the cupboard under the stairs was full of them, and that was where he slept. When he was dressed, he went down the hall into the kitchen. The table was almost hidden beneath old Dudley's birthday present. It looked like as though Dudley had gotten the new computer he wanted, not to mention the second television and the racing bike. Exactly why Dudley wanted a racing bike was a mystery to Harry, as Dudley was very fat and hated exercise. Unless, of course, it involved punching somebody. Dudley's favorite punching bag was Harry, but he wouldn't often catch him. Harry didn't look it, but he was very fast. Perhaps it had something to do with living in a dark cupboard, but Harry had always been small and skinny for his age. He looked even smaller and skinnier than he really was because all he had to wear were old clothes of Dudley's, and Dudley was about 4 times bigger than he was. Harry had a thin face, no bleeding knees, black hair, and bright green eyes. He wore round glasses and held together with a lot of scotch tape because of all the time Dudley had punched him in the nose. The only thing Harry liked about his own appearance was a very thin scar on his forehead that was shaped like a bolt of lightning. He had had it as long as he could remember, and the first question he could ever remember asking his Aunt Petunia was how he had gotten it. In the car crash when your parent died, he had said, and don't ask questions. Don't ask questions. That was the first rule for a quiet life with the Dursleys. Uncle Vernon entered the kitchen as Harry was turning over the bacon. Comb your hair, he barked, by way of a morning greeting. About once a week, Uncle Vernon looked over the top of his newspaper and shouted that Harry needed a haircut. Harry must have more haircut than the rest of the boys in his class put together, but it made no difference. His hair simply grew that way, all over the place. Harry was frying eggs by the time Dudley arrived in the kitchen with his mother. Dudley looked a lot like Uncle Vernon. He had a large pink face, not much neck, small watery blue eyes, and thick blonde hair that lay smoothly on his thick fat head. Aunt Petunia often said that Dudley looked like a baby angel. Harry often said that Dudley looked like a pig in a wig. Harry put on plates of eggs and bacon at the table, which was difficult as there wasn't much room. Dudley, meanwhile, was counting his presents. His face fell. 36, he said, looking up at his mother and father. That was 2 less than last year. Darling, you haven't counted Aunt March's present, see? It's here under the big one from Mummy and Daddy. All right, 37 then, said Dudley, going red in the face. Harry, who could see a huge Dudley tantrum coming on, began wolfing down his bacon as fast as possible in case Dudley turned the table over. Aunt Petunia obviously scented danger too, because she said quickly, and we will buy another 2 presents while we're out today. How's that, Pumpkin? 2 more presents. Is that all right? Dudley thought for a moment. It looked like hard work. Finally, he said slowly, so I'll have 39 sweet tums, said Aunt Petunia. Oh, Dudley sat down heavily and grabbed the nearest parcel. All right, then. Uncle Vernon chuckled. Little Tyke won his money's worth, just like his father. Attaboy, Dudley. He ruffled Dudley's hair. At that moment, the telephone rang and Aunt Petunia went to answer while Harry and Uncle Vernon watched Dudley unwrap the racing bike, a video camera, a remote control airplane, 16 new computer games, and a VCR. He was ripping the paper off a gold wristwatch when Aunt Petunia came back from the telephone looking both angry and worried. Bad news, Vernon, she said. Mrs. Fitch's broke her leg. She can't take him. She jerked her head in Harry's direction. Dudley's mouth fell open in horror, but Harry's heart gave a leap. Every year on Dudley's birthday, his parents took him and a friend out for the day to adventure parks, hamburger restaurants, or the movies. Every year, Harry was left behind with Mr. Fig, a mad old lady who lived two streets away. Harry hated there. The whole house smelled of cabbage, and Miss Fig made him look at photographs of all the cat she'd ever owned. Now what? Said Aunt Petunia, looking furiously at Harry as though he had planned this. Harry knew he ought to feel sorry that Mrs. Fig has broken her legs, but it wasn't easy when he reminded himself it could be a whole year before he had to look at Fibbles, Snowy, Mr. Powell, and Tufty again. We could phone Marge, Uncle Vernon suggested. Don't be silly, Vernon. She hated the boy. The Dudley often spoke about Harry like this, as though he wasn't there, or rather, as though he was something very nasty. They couldn't understand them, like a slug. What about, what's her name, your friend Vernon? On a vacation in Majorca, snapped Aunt Petunia. You could just leave me here, Harry put in hopefully. He'd be able to watch he wanted on the television for a change, and maybe even have a go on Dudley's computer. Aunt Petunia looked as though she'd just swallowed a lemon. And come back and find the house in ruins? She snarled. I won't blow up the house, said Harry, but they weren't listening. I suppose we could take him to the zoo, said Aunt Petunia slowly, and leave him in the car. That car is new. He's not sitting in it alone. Dudley began to cry out loud. In fact, he wasn't really crying. It had been years since he really cried, but he knew if he screamed up his face and wailed, his mother would give him anything he wanted. Dinky Dudley Dums, don't cry. Mommy won't let him spoil his special day, she cried, flinging her arm around him. I don't want him to come. Dudley yelled between huge pretended sobs. He always spoils everything. He shot Harry a nasty grin through the gaps of his mother's arm. Just then the doorbell rang. Oh, good Lord, they're here, said Aunt Petunia fanatically, and a moment later Dudley's best friend, Piers Porkis, walked in with his mother. Piers was a scrawny boy with a face like a rat. He was usually the one who held people's arms behind their backs while Dudley hid them. Dudley stopped pretending to cry at once. Half an hour later, Harry, who couldn't believe his luck, was sitting in the back of Dudley's car with Piers and Dudley on the way to the zoo for the first time in his life. His aunt and uncle hadn't been able to think of anything else to do with him, but before they left, Uncle Vernon had taken Harry aside. I'm warning you, he had said, putting his large purple face right up close to Harry's. I'm warning you now, boy. Any funny business, anything at all, and you'll be in that cupboard from now till Christmas. I'm not going to do anything, said Harry, honestly. But Uncle Vernon didn't believe him. No one ever did. The problem was, strange things always happen around Harry, and it was just no good telling the Dursleys he didn't make them happen. Once, Aunt Petunia tired of Harry coming back from the barber's, looking as though he had been at all, had taken a pair of kitchen scissors and cut his hair so short he was almost bald except for his bangs, which he left to hide that horrible scar. Dudley has laughed himself silly at Harry, who spent a sleepless night imagining school the next day, where he was already left for his baggy clothes and taped glasses. Next morning, however, he had gotten up to find his hair exactly as it has been before Aunt Petunia had sheared it off. He had been given a week in his cupboard for this, even though he had tried to explain that he couldn't explain how he has grown back so quickly. Another time, Aunt Petunia has been trying to force him into a revolting old sweater of Dudley's, brown with orange puffballs. The harder he tried to put it on over his head, the smaller it seems to become, until finally it might have fitted a hand puppet, but certainly wouldn't fit Harry. Aunt Petunia has decided it must have been shrank in a wash, and, to his great relief, Harry wasn't punished. On the other hand, he's gotten into trouble, terrible trouble, for being found on the roof on the school kitchens. Dudley's gang had been chasing him as usual when, as much to Harry's surprise as anyone else, there he was sitting on the chimney. The Dursleys has received a very angry letter from Harry's headmistress telling them Harry has been climbing school buildings. But all he tried to do as he shouted at Uncle Vernon through the locked doors of a cupboard was jump behind the big trash can outside the kitchen doors. Harry supposed that wind must have caught him in the mid-jump. But today, nothing is going to go wrong. It was even worse being with Dursleys and Pierce to be spending the day somewhere that wasn't school, his cupboard, or Miss Figg's cabbage-smell living room. While he drove, Uncle Vernon complained to Aunt Petunia. He likes to complain about things. People at work, Harry, the council, Harry, the bank, and Harry was just few favorite subjects. This morning it was motorcycles, rolling along like maniacs, the young hoodlums, he said, as a motorcycle overtook them. I had a dream about a motorcycle, said Harry, remembering suddenly. It was flying. Uncle Vernon nearly crashed into the car in front. He turned right around his seat and yelled at Harry, his face like a gigantic beet with a mustache. Motorcycle don't fly. Dudley and Pierce sniggered. I know they don't, said Harry. It was only a dream. But he wished he hadn't said anything. If there was one thing that Dursleys hate even more than his asking questions, it was his talking about anything acting in a way that he shouldn't. No matter it was a dream to even a cartoon, they seemed to think he might get dangerous ideas. It was very sunny Saturday, and the zoo was crowded with families. The Dursley bought Dudley and Pierce large chocolate ice cream at the entrance, and then, because the smiling lady in the van had asked Harry what he wanted before they could hurry him away, they bought him cheap lemon ice pop. It wasn't bad either, Harry thought, licking it as they watched a gorilla scratching his head, who looked remarkably like Dudley, except that it wasn't blonde. Harry had the best morning he had in a long time. He was careful to walk a little way apart from the Dudleys so that Dudley and Pierce, who were starting to get bored with the animal by lunchtime, wouldn't fall back on their favorite hobby of hitting him. They ate in the zoo restaurant, and when Dudley had a tantrum because his kickboxer Glory didn't have enough ice cream on top, Uncle Vernon bought him another one, and Harry was allowed to finish the first. Harry felt afterwards that he should have known it was all too good to last. After lunch, they went to the reptile house. It was cool and dark in there, with lit window and all along the walls. Behind the glasses, all sorts of lizards and snakes were crawling and slithering all over bits of wood and stone. Dudley and Pierce went to see huge poisonous cobras and thick man-crushing pythons. Dudley quickly found the largest snake in the place. It could have been wrapped in its body twice around Uncle Vernon's car and crushed it into a trash can. But at the moment, it didn't look the mood. In fact, it was fast asleep. Dudley stood with his nose pressed against the glass, staring at the glistening brown coils. Make a move, he whined as his father. Uncle Vernon tapped on the glass, but the snake didn't budge. Do it again, Dudley ordered. Uncle Vernon rapped the glass smartly with his knuckles, but the snake just snoozed on. This is boring, Dudley moaned. He shuffled away. Harry moved in from the tank and looked intensely at the snake. He wouldn't have been surprised if it had died of boredom itself. No company except stupid people drumming their fingers on the glass, trying to disturb it all day long. It was worse than having cupboard as a bedroom, where the only visitors were Aunt Petunia humming on the door to wake you up. At least he got to visit the rest of the house. The snake suddenly opened its beady eyes. Slowly, very slowly, it raised its head until its eyes were on the level with Harry's. It winked. Harry stared. Then he looked quickly around to see if anyone was watching. They weren't. He looked at the snake and winked too. The snake jerked its head towards Uncle Vernon and Dudley and then raised its glass to the ceiling. It gave Harry a look that says quite plainly, "I get that all the time." "I know." Harry murmured through the glass, though he wasn't sure the snake would hear him. It must be really annoying. The snake nodded vigorously. "Where did you come from, anyways?" Harry asked. The snake jabbed its tail at the little sign next to the glass. Harry peered at it. Boa constrictor, Brazil. Was it nice there? The boa constrictor jabbed its tail at the sign again, and Harry read on. This specimen was bred in the zoo. Oh, I see. So you've never been to Brazil? As the snake shook his head, a deafening shout behind Harry made both of them jump. "Dudley! Mr. Dudley! Come and look at the snake. You wouldn't believe what it's doing." Dudley came waddling towards them as fast as he could. "Out of the way, you!" he said, punching Harry in the ribs. Caught by surprise, Harry fell hard on the concrete floor. What came next happened so fast, no one see how it happens. 1 second, Pierce and Dudley was leaning right up to the glass. The next, they had leaped back with a howl of horrors. Harry sat up and gasped. The glass in front of the boa construction tank has vanished. The great snake was uncoiling itself rapidly, slithing out onto the floor. People throughout the reptile house screamed and started running for the exit. As the snake slid swiftly past him, Harry could have sworn a low hissing voice said, "Brazil. Here I come. Thanks, amigo." The keeper of the reptile house was in shock. "But the glass," he kept saying. "Where did the glass go?" The zoo director himself made Aunt Petunia a cup of strong sweet tea while he apologized over and over again. Pierce and Dudley would only gabber. As far as Harry had seen, the snake didn't done anything except snarled playfully at their heels as it passed, but by the time they were all backing out of Uncle Vernon's car, Dudley was telling them how it had nearly bitten off his leg, while Pierce was swearing it had tried to squeeze him to death. But worst of all, for Harry at least, was Pierce calming down enough to say, "Harry was talking to it, weren't you, Harry?" Uncle Vernon waited until Pierce was safely out of the house before starting on Harry. He was so angry he could hardly speak. He managed to say, "Go, cupboards, stay, no meals," before he collapsed onto a chair, and Aunt Petunia had to run and get him a large brandy. Harry lay in his dark cupboard much later, wishing he had a watch. He didn't know what time it was, and he couldn't be sure the Dursleys were asleep yet. Until they were, he couldn't risk sneaking to the kitchen for some food. He lived with the Dursleys almost 10 years, 10 miserable years, as long as he could remember, ever since he's been a baby, and his parents had died in a car crash. He couldn't remember being in a car when his parents had died. Sometimes, when he strained his memory during long hours in his cupboard, he came up with a strange vision, a blinding flash of green light and a burning pain in his forehead. This, as he supposed, was the crash, though he couldn't imagine where all the green light came from. He couldn't remember his parents at all. His aunt and uncle never spoke about them, and of course he was forbidden to ask questions. There were no photographs of them in the house. When he had been younger, Harry had dreamed and dreamed that someone unknown relations came to take him away, but it has never happened. The Dursleys were his only family. Yet sometimes he thought, or maybe hoped, that strangers in the street seemed to know him. Very strange strangers they were, too. A tiny man in a violet top hat had bowed to him once out of shopping with Aunt Petunia and Dudley. After asking Harry furiously if he knew the man, Aunt Petunia has rushed them out of the shop without buying anything. A wild-looking old woman dressed all green and have waved merrily at him once in a bus. A bold man in a very long purple coat had actually shaken his hand in the street another day and then walked away without a word. The weirdest thing out of all the people was the way they seemed to vanish the second Harry tried to get a closer look. At school, Harry had no one. Everybody knew that Dudley's gang hated that old Harry Potter and his baggy old clothes and broken glasses, and no one liked to disagree with Dudley's gang.